photograph that's something that's happening in the garden. Last week, Science, the journal, actually published a paper saying that plants can smell. Did anybody see that paper? It said they don't have noses, but that they have the capacity to detect odors. Well, this picture is of something called a Buddha's hand. It's a kind of a citrus. It's really unusual. It doesn't have a lot of edible parts to it, but it's incredibly aromatic. And when I looked at this yesterday morning, I was struck that not only was it a beautiful fruit, but it was actually hugging another plant. So not only can plants smell, but they seem to have some attraction for other plants. I didn't do that. It did that all by itself. Next week, I'll bring that in. It'll be ripe, and you can smell it yourself. So that's in my garden. So tonight, we're going to be talking about the power of transparency. We have a wonderful guest who's flown all the way across the country. Urvashi Rangan is here from New York. And also, we have a special guest tonight. The president of Urvashi's cheering club is Marion Nessel, who also comes all the way from New York. Marion's here. Marion is really a very important person in the food movement and industry and every part of food. I shouldn't have said industry, Marion. I apologize for that. Last week, we talked about serendipity, so I just thought it was wonderful that Marion was here. Marion, in Marion's background, Marion's a three-time alumna of UC Berkeley, undergrad, grad, and PhD, and studied biology, biochemistry, and serendipitously got assigned to teach a nutrition course, right, as a postdoc. And so ended up in nutrition back when nutrition was defined like Joan Gussow says in the article, everything after the swallow, right? So, I don't know, it's just serendipitous that Marion's back at Berkeley. You're all in the same room with Marion and Urvashi. We also talked about systems last week. We talked about the complexity of systems and starting to see systems and begin to understand potentially where we might intervene in a system, understand its feedback loops, its causal systems, its penchant for risk. And this week I learned a new word, syndemic. Anybody else learn that word? Anybody know it? Marion, you know what that word is. I'll call on you. Syndemic. Well, I knew what an epidemic was. Where are public health majors here in the room? Okay. So you know that an epidemic is when a contagious or an infectious disease spreads rapidly in an environment. And then I've heard the word pandemic, which means that infectious, contagious disease spreads not only in a locale, but across countries, across the globe. But syndemic is actually the convergence and integration of multiple epidemics and pandemics at the same time. It's not really a word you probably want to hear too much, but it comes out as the headline or the name of a new paper or new commission report that comes out from the Lancet, again, the second one this month, identifying that overeating, which leads to obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, malnutrition, undernourishment, and climate change are all implicated in this trifecta of epidemics. So what I think is interesting about this is that this is sort of the finally kind of what we talked about last week, the crossing of the chasm of this de-siloization of these different fields really coming together to connect food to everything that has to do with health and climate. So you're sitting in the right room. Remember also last week I introduced you to this systems dance, and I was sharing this with a number of people this week who really liked it. And I thought, do we have any musicians in the room or poets? Any rappers? Because I think this would be an incredible rap. If anybody would be willing, I know we have some media studies people, so maybe we could do like a music video. But if anybody wants to take this on as a performance piece for the end of the class for your final project, I'm in. Seriously, I think we could bring this really to life. Also last week you met someone new, I hope, from a different field or different background or different area of study who, you described your most memorable meal. And then I remember I talked to you a little bit about this practice of mind mapping. And hopefully if you have a piece of paper or a pen, you can follow along with me. But I tried to mind map one of my most recent meals. So I start, if you got to watch that little video on mind mapping I shared with you, you try to start with a central image that kind of enlivens you. This is a close-up of that image. This was my most memorable recent meal. That is a plate of vegetables prepared in kind of an astonishing way. So to make a mind map, I started to delineate like what's on the plate. Well, there's asparagus, there's arugula, both leaves and flowers. There's some eggs that have been hard-boiled or soft-boiled and broken up. And then on top, that kind of beige-colored stuff, that's like a pistachio butter. And then I said, okay, well, where did each of those come from? I tried to think about, what was the source or what was the origin of each of those vegetables or the eggs. And so the asparagus actually came from a farm that's not too far from where I live, and so did the eggs. The arugula, flowers, and leaves actually came from my garden. And then the pistachio butter came from some cool hipster place in Portland that I bought at a store. So then I started to think about, all right, well, what might be the health benefits of asparagus? I just picked asparagus. And, it has lots of fiber. It's a good source of folate. It's got vitamins A and K. It seemed like a pretty nutritious vegetable. And then I started to think, okay, well, what might be the carbon footprint of asparagus? And it was like, oh, no. I found this chart. It was like a yikes chart. It actually turns out that the carbon footprint of asparagus is like 7 times higher than the next vegetable or fruit. Well, why is that? I mean, asparagus kind of grows all the time. You don't have to like take it out. It kind of regenerates itself. Well, it turns out that the majority of asparagus is actually air freighted in for us to eat. So that's why it has such a huge carbon footprint. Most asparagus that we eat in California and the rest of the people in the United States eat is actually grown in Peru. So it has an enormous carbon footprint. So I felt a little bit relieved because the asparagus we were eating that night actually came from just down the road, and I picked it up on my way home so that the guy up there in the top right-hand corner who actually cooked that meal, a guy named Dan Barber, he was here last year. That's one of the things that made it really memorable. So as you think about creating a map or a mind map of your experience, you might start to develop different understanding of the relationship. So this is just kind of the beginning. I wanted to introduce you to sort of an old-fashioned thinking tool. We do so much on our computers and our screens now, but this was created by a man named Tony Buzan, who promotes the idea of radiant thinking. And I think that radiant thinking is an important toolkit for you as we delve into becoming, developing our food systems intelligence, which is one of the core intentions of the class. So tonight we're going to talk about transparency, and I made this slide because I like to think about developing our ability to seize transparency or develop a view of transparency almost like a superpower. There's so much opacity and obfuscation of information in the food system. I mean, there are organizations that do nothing but create confusion about the facts or the perspective in food, and the laws that relate to labeling, description are just confounding. And we'll learn more about that as the semester goes on. If you read any of Marian's books, she talks a lot about this. But our guest tonight is a real expert in the field of transparency and also how we're bringing new tools and sort of disparate actors together to bring light and transparency to the food industry. Now, I met Urvashi a long time ago. She worked at a place that was considered a real institution. I mean, I think back, you know, before Yelp and before Amazon reviews and user-generated content, before the internet, my mother-in-law used to rely religiously on a publication called Consumer Reports. Anybody heard of that? I didn't think so. Consumer Reports was an independent, nonprofit, rigorously science-based organization that tested everything from apples to dishwashers. And every month they published this amazing magazine, and they were completely separate from any kind of influence. They had no advertising. It was a completely different model in its day, and I don't think we really have anything that compares to it, and people would really trust it. You're still a subscriber? Good, okay, it still exists. I'm not saying it's gone, but I'm just saying one person raised their hand in the room when I said, have you heard of it? Okay, 2, 3, thank you. My point is we're not necessarily relying on independent sources of information as often, maybe. But anyway, Urvashi was for about 15 years focused on all of their food safety and food security, and she really made a mark. And she comes to us, as I said, from New York. She's got her PhD from Johns Hopkins in environmental health. That was a little different than the narrow portal of nutrition. It was kind of the synthesis of 2 disparate fields at the time. But now she continues to lead the way as the Director of Communications at Grace. Not the Director of Research at Grace Communications, and is doing all kinds of innovative things with lots of different groups. So without further ado, please welcome Urvashi Rangan.
Thank you. I'm just going to get set up here. Awesome. Thank you. It's so great to be here, and I really appreciate the invitation from Will. And as Will said, we met a long time ago, and I find him incredibly inspiring. You're all really lucky to have him teaching you this kind of systems thinking. It's something that's really special, and it takes a lot to think that way and that dimensionally. And what an extra treat to have Marion. I have been a huge fan of Marion for a long time, and I'm a relative babe in the woods compared to Marion in this field. And we were just talking outside the door. Joan, whose reading you did, is now 90. And wouldn't it be nice if we could fix some of these things so that generation after generation after generation didn't have to do it? But so with that, I just want to say thank you. And it's not hard to get me to come back to the Bay Area because I grew up here and went to school in Oakland. And just driving here, I passed where I got rear-ended and where I got in trouble one night for not showing up at home, and where I took my physics and European history class here on this campus. So it's near and dear to me. I love Berkeley, and I love the fact that you all are from such a diverse walk of fields. It's so inspiring to see that in food. It's exactly what food needs these days. We need every kind of mind from every different discipline thinking about it. So I'm super excited to share with you today the many slides I've created. Now, I had to delete slides at the end of this because there are so many examples of lack of transparency in this world that I can't possibly go through it all. And so, you know, chime in if you don't see things on slides so that everyone gets the benefit of it. But I'd like to think this is at least some examples of things going on out there for the better and the worst. And I'm looking forward to bring this to you. So I just got back from Italy last week, which is an amazing place. And I had the privilege of being with a lot of foundations who are interested in these systemic questions around food and food systems. It's called the Global Alliance for the Future of Food. And we were staying in a 14th century monastery for 4 days. It was pretty intense. And the pictures I took were sort of illuminating as well. So the talk's peppered through with those pictures too, just so you can have a little sneak peek of my own trip there. Okay, and now I need to figure out just which button to press. Great. Okay, so quickly, if we're giving a talk, if I am on transparency, you should know a little bit about me. As Will mentioned, I'm an environmental health scientist, and when I started in the School of Public Health at Hopkins, smoking was the biggest environmental health issue. We didn't even have lectures on food. I remember a lecture on paraquat and cannabis, and that was disturbing, that pesticide, and how it caused reactive oxygen recycling and death in some people, but that was about it. And so I made my way from that training into food, really in large part at Consumer Reports and running their consumer food safety and sustainability program. Today, I'm work part-time as the Chief Science Advisor for Grace Communications Foundation, and I spend a lot of my time in the philanthropic world trying to help deepen these conversations and making sure that foundations are at least helping them to see things clearly and to reveal things so that people can invest their money in ways that are truly for the long-term investment and value. Like I said, I also was the executive director at the Food Safety Center. I did a lot of investigations there on arsenic in rice, caramel color in sodas, and a bunch of other things. I'm not going to get into all of them, but I'll just say that transparency is sort of the common theme in investigating anything. You're always looking for, one, you want to make some comparisons among products out there. So in a lot of these cases, we were looking at conventional versus more sustainable and trying to measure safety attributes and noting differences where there were differences, and then weaving that in with the policies, and also just looking at some of the externalities of some of those systems. So arsenic in juice, for example, well, there's also arsenic in rice, and part of that is from naturally occurring arsenic, but part of that was that we were feeding chickens arsenic drugs so we could pink the meat a little bit, and then that compost was going into rice fields, and rice, if arsenic's there, loves to take it up. And so we were creating this very ridiculous loop of compounding a toxin in our food system. And so by revealing that, and that was about 8 years ago, we were able to make some moves with FDA and getting some standards set around arsenic, and also in helping to eliminate the use of those arsenical drugs in poultry production. But we didn't know all those things when we started, and so transparency is a really interesting thing. You don't know what you don't know. And so you have to become an investigator in lots of ways. And I'm going to kind of take you through some different avenues of the food system and show you some places where transparency lacks. Will talked a little bit about this, about some of the values that you all identified when you were thinking about your most memorable meal. And I love Will's map and the asparagus, and just you have these aha moments. And of course, we eat 2-3 meals a day, and those, what was in Will's most memorable meal is actually common to every meal we have every day, isn't it? And the foods that we choose all the time. And it's amazing how much goes into producing those foods and how much we really don't know about that. And I would just maybe get all of you who are interested in food systems to think about agricultural systems in general as well. We grow things like cotton and other textiles that way, and we also produce botanicals and other things that we use in personal care products, in cleaning products. And so agriculture and the issues behind what goes on in food also pertains to what goes on in a lot of these agricultural commodities. And a lot happens when we don't know about things. We sometimes just don't know, and it's just an omission. And sometimes it's more than that. It's misleading, and sometimes it's even deceptive or illegal. And uncovering these things is really important so that as we're looking for solutions in the system, we're actually not myopic and choosing things that are what we call regrettable. So BPA, has anybody heard about bisphenol A in packaging? Bisphenol A is one of the more toxic plastics out there, and it's been phased out of baby bottles, certainly, but it's, and certainly water drinking bottles and things like that. You see a lot of BPA-free. Trouble with that is that the alternatives were BPG and BPH and BPD and all sorts of other BP bisphenolic products that turns out are probably going to have comparable toxicity to BPA. But because of the lack of transparency, because the government itself doesn't even know what these formulations are in these plastics, in these liners of cans and packaging and food packaging in general, we ended up on a totally wrong trajectory in terms of the solutions, and they're called regrettable solutions, and that's one of the consequences when you don't have full transparency in the system. So, you know, this is really, in terms of transparency, there are things companies can do better, and there are things that we can also do better in terms of making sure we're finding out the right information. So providing the honest information is really important, making sure that it's complete and that it's reliable. And that is the way to have true accountability. If you don't have full transparency, it's very hard to have full accountability. And for consumers to be able to know all of that, and right to know is something that we use in policy work, which is that we all have a right to know about how our food's produced, where it came from, and we have a right to know about a lot of other things too. Okay, so the first thing, and this is just my mind map, and I'm starting with this one, but just in terms of a systems approach, which is that when we look at food systems in general, we need to think about resilience in the food system and how we create that from a variety of different places. So animal welfare and health, human health, social welfare, and environmental welfare. And each of these are really broad. So I don't mean to oversimplify it, but I just want to start out with the fully sort of distilled vision of these systems, which is that these are at least the nuclear set of things we have to be thinking about. Lots of things fit into environment, right? Soil, water, air, land, climate change. And in human health, we have both the consequences of contamination and pollution, but also the benefits like nutrient density. Animal welfare, health, and safety is also incredibly important, and all these things are literally tied together. They're literally all linked up. What I'm showing in green here around the edges are the different conversations on meetings that I'm in just recently that have a little lens into food. And so sometimes I'm in a meeting about toxics and or toxics in food, and with public health officials who are really focused on toxic exposures. And yet sustainable food solutions should be very much a part of what they're thinking about as well. So a lot of these connections are just starting to be made now, but it's really exciting to start to see the overlap. Climate now, also with the IPCC report, also has a lot of threads into food, of course not only food, but agriculture offers not only impacts in climate, but also benefits in climate, especially pasture-based systems, carbon soil sequestration, which I know you're going to learn about more next week, but there are some really interesting things going on that level too. Meat reduction, and I know there's a question on that and some of the meat alternatives out there. Those folks are out there sometimes talking way out on the limbs, and there's an entire integrated system here that really needs to be thought about so that, again, we end up with the right alternatives, that we're going in the right direction based on all of these lessons that we've known. Oh, terrible. Okay, this slide, I'm so sorry. Every time I copy this slide over, I realize it's animated, and it just drives me crazy. So these are, okay, sorry about this. Okay, I just bring this up because on the right are just certain practices that are used in agriculture. So now I'm just focusing on food production. Things like confinement, space for animals, physical alterations. We give healthy animals drugs just about every day in conventional agriculture. We don't have very good hygiene standards on the farm. We tend to be an end of the line, dip the carcass into bleach or other kind of solutions to get rid of pathogens rather than dealing with the sort of cleanliness at the beginning of the chain, or the root cause really of where these problems start. We've got pesticide exposure. We have manure management issues, forced molting. Does anybody know what that is? You don't have it in California anymore because there's a law actually that prevents it, but this is where you starve chickens and put them in the dark to sort of eke out one last round of egg laying from them, and it's called forced molting. It's really terrible. It's got a 30% mortality rate associated with it. So these are all sorts of things that go on in industrial food production, and it's color-coded to show you how the impacts cross in all those different areas. So when you think about things like confinement, that isn't just an animal being confined and that's the only issue. It's linked to so many other issues. So the pathogen load on that farm, the spread and the incubation of that, that's related actually to how close those animals are housed together. The pathogen frequency then that you'll find on the final product, that's also related to confinement issues. And so similarly with prophylactic drugs, you feed drugs to animals every day, you start to propagate what we are in a global health crisis about, which is antibiotic resistance. That is bacteria becoming resistant to multiple drugs, and therefore when we get infected, they become more difficult to treat. And so that use, where we use 80% of our antibiotics in agriculture, is exacerbating that problem, and that ends up in animal health problems, that ends up in public health problems. And I'm sorry, at the bottom, what is missing is the environmental health, but all of these things link to each other in terms of impact. And this is just another way of looking at it, and it's another wheel, and lots of people have different wheels out there and systems, but it gives you a sense of the complexity of all of the different things we need to actually take into account in order to make sure that our foodprint can be as minimal as possible. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these things as we go through some of the case studies. And just to take you one level deeper now in terms of sustainable agriculture, I just want to talk a little bit about organic for a second, and I'm going to come back to that later. But I, in my own work, start to see organic now as kind of a floor for what's reasonable in terms of sustainability. There's a lot of claims out there like free range, and we'll talk about them later, that really are far below that bar. But if we think about organic and the fact that it requires natural fertilizers and not synthetic ones, not fossil fuel dependent, which has a big greenhouse gas implication. If we think about the limited pesticide use, well, not perfect, it's really one of the few systems that does have pretty broad regulations on that. Farm plans are required, no GMOs. There's more to it than that, but those core things are really core to sustainable food production plans. Now, you can start to build on that. You can have a grass-fed system, for example, that doesn't address those things, but it isn't really an authentic grass-fed system. And so organic and the principles behind organic, whether you like it or not, whether you think it's too good or not good enough, if you're interested in sustainable food, organic should be really front and center in terms of your focus of what is, in fact, a floor for how we think about sustainable and regenerative agriculture. These things that start to move on the outer circles are things that organic is starting a little bit with. Biodiversity. There's a new regulation on biodiversity that requires farmers to have a biodiversity plan, but that can grow and is just a beginning now in organic. Animal health is something that has not quite made it into the organic program in a really meaningful way, but it is a field that is growing and emerging, and there are a lot of really interesting options out there, and it is, in fact, very much part and parcel of having a sustainable system. And then when you raise those animals on the food they were meant to eat, like grass, because they're ruminants and they need to eat pasture, then you start to get into pasture-raised systems, and there are a lot of really interesting benefits that we'll get into in just a second. But now starting to think about carbon conservation and nutrient density, and starting to understand that what we're seeing in the soil actually is linked to what we get out the other end. And we are now starting to really be able to make those connections, and it's really pretty fascinating where what we do in the environment truly affects the health of the entire system and all the way out to the other end. Okay, so this is just another quick look of just, comparing industrial versus sustainable systems and the kind of each side of the rainbow we're trying to get to. In regenerative systems, we're really looking for low chemical input, really minimal drug use where animals are only treated if they're sick, not otherwise. No synthetic pesticides or fertilizers, I should have up there. We talked about the food and biodiversity, and soil health is in many respects dependent on that. If you put rapid nitrogen release fertilizers in the soil, you start to wreck the ecology of the soil. You start to wreck the biome of the soil. Pesticides kill things in the soil. So while you can't see it, there's an entire world going on in soil that Daphne Miller is going to be talking to you next week that really matters in terms of what the plants take up, their nutrient density, and good fertilizers, well composted, also matter in terms of making sure that there isn't pathogen spread going on in crop production as well. Sorry, and one last thing is just to talk about the social justice component and talk about labor and who's making our food and how are they treated and how well are they paid and are they protected from the things that are hazardous in their jobs. Slaughterhouse workers are among the they're in the highest risk jobs. They suffer incredible injuries. They're usually some of the lowest paid workers out there, and they're generally very underrepresented. And so justice and welfare in that space is incredibly important when we're talking about food systems. Okay, and this is one program out there that you'll see this year that's coming out called Regenerative Organic Certified, and it's one of the labels that is built on organic and will add these other attributes on animal welfare and social justice out there. So it's really nice to be able to see that we're getting to a space now where we're starting to bring all of these parameters in, and this is something that's been put together by Patagonia and Dr. Bronner's and Rodale, and so it's really interesting. It'll apply both to the cotton that Patagonia is procuring as well as the ingredients in a lot of the Dr. Bronner personal care products as well as food. And so it's a really interesting agricultural label that's going to be coming out at the end of this year, and they're prototyping it right now. Okay, so I want to get into transparency issues in animal production right now and focus on animal production. These are just a few of the problems in transparency. We don't really know about animal use, antibiotic use in a specific way. There's been new legislation that's gone through in the past few years that have required the Food and Drug Administration to do better accounting of the drugs that are used. Right now, they'll only tell us about drugs that are used in human medicine that are used in animal agriculture. There's 450 drugs approved in animal agriculture. So we don't really know what's going on in terms of the use behind that. There is pesticide use in animal ag, and we use a fair amount of pesticides there. Again, we don't track use in that area very well at all, and we don't know about it. Residue frequency and calculation. So the government often has programs where they will go out and sample things, and there's a lot of data sets out there looking at residues. And one thing that was very disturbing and perplexing in the work I've done over the years is constantly coming across, oh, the government tested arsenic in juice or arsenic in rice or caramel color, 4-MEI carcinogen in sodas. But these are all marked as not detectable. And so recently I was looking at a data set, and Food and Water Watch actually has this data set posted with antibiotic and pesticide residues in every kind of meat. And the government has been fighting this and saying that all this data that they dumped out is in fact not true. and they actually changed a number of their data values to non-detects and are trying to resubmit it as that. So what happens is when the government goes out and actually does the testing of these residues, they make arbitrary decisions about what is reportable, and they often confuse that with what is above the detection limit. And so there are things and residues that we are finding out there that are somewhere between an action level and the ability to detect. And by not disclosing those things, we do not learn about really the totality of residues in our system, the plurality of residues that we find on things, and again, that being hidden from view and not being labeled certainly makes for consumers that really don't even think there's a problem there, and yet there's a big problem there. There's also off-label animal drug use, so any company can use any drug they want to, and as long as a vet who's working for them clears it, you can use it in a way that's called off-label. And that means that even though the drug was approved for a particular use, it doesn't have to be that use. It can be off of that label use. And so you get the idea that it's sort of a free-for-all out there in terms of drugs that can be mixed in animal feed, and we really have no good sense of what's going on, and yet the ramifications on public health are really significant, and that isn't really a sustainable system for us right now at all. Animal feed formulations are another thing that are also confidential business information and we don't know a lot about. So I'm going to just take you through, again, quickly, and this is sort of the tale of two cows and through their different systems. Living conditions, there are stark differences in living conditions. We've talked about hygiene. But in this regenerative system, animals have space. They don't get confined. They live on pasture, and they don't get drugs every day. They get their nutrition solely from the food that they're eating, and that's it. And that makes for better digestion for those animals and better health for those animals. The environmental impact's interesting in that in conventional systems, we pile manure together, or in the case of hog farms, we have lagoons of manure. And as many of you may have seen in Hurricane Florence, we have those lagoons spilling over in North Carolina as a result of the flooding that went on there. So these things are not controllable. We have massive contamination going on in the environment as a result. In pasture-based systems, you're composting the manure, you have enough animals, or you don't exceed the space capacity of the land to be able to take that manure and recycle it there on the land. And so in that way, you don't create this crazy manure management problem that becomes a cesspool essentially for pathogens and antibiotic resistance. The feed is also very different. It's amazing what animals can eat. We actually take poultry litter and we'll put it into animal feed. It is actually deemed as a nutritional source of food for animals by the FDA. And old candy, baking products, corn grain distillery waste, all of these things end up in animal feed. And it's become literally a stream for where the garbage in our processed food goes to. And this is what many of our animals are being raised on today. And again, not very sustainable and not very healthy for the animals either. In a sustainable system, as I mentioned, especially in a beef system and a dairy system, they're eating what they're supposed to eat. And by doing that, they're creating an incredible amount of conjugated linoleic acids, and those are the sort of good fatty acids, the sort of basis of the omega-3, omega-6 ratios, and making more vitamin E, making more vitamin A. It's better for the animal, it's better for their digestion, it's better for their health, and it turns out it makes for a more nutrient-dense meat in the end, too. And so the ramifications of doing it right really cascade through the entire system that we're trying to talk about. And we didn't talk about the workers here, but I did mention to you a little bit about injury rates and occupational health. But you may hear in the news, we're just constantly increasing line speeds. USDA actually wants to do away with line speeds and processing line speeds in hog production, in pork processing. which is crazy. The line speeds are so fast right now that that's part of the problem for why you get so much injury. Once you start nicking things like the gut, that's where you get food contamination onto the meat. Muscle is sterile until you contaminate it, and so processing is incredibly important, and good processing matters. And so how clean the product is coming in makes a huge difference on how clean it is going out. And it turns out that the health of the product is also very connected to the health of the product coming out. And grass-fed beef and pasture-raised beef and dairy has been proven scientifically to have a better nutrient profile. And in some of the tests we did at Consumer Reports, we actually showed lower levels of E. coli and lower levels of multi-drug resistance in pasture-based systems. Okay, so now jumping to crop production. There's also a lot of lack of transparency in that. Pesticide use, again, pesticide formulations are often not disclosed. The only thing that's disclosed on a pesticide packet is the active ingredient. All the other ingredients, which could be dozens and dozens of them, can be filed under what's called inert ingredients. And yet, these inert ingredients are not inert. They have ramifications, they have toxicities associated with them. And so it's very difficult for farmers to actually know what they're getting in a given package of any kind of pesticide formulation. Adverse health event reporting in workers is not very good, and I'll talk a little bit about how we've come to know the toxicity of pesticides, but it is because workers have gotten sick. And cancer takes a long time to develop, so we wait many years, and people are exposed to a lot of this before we have confirmation of harm. And we don't regulate pesticides very well until we've proven harm, when really what we need to be doing is proving safety in the first place before all of these get approved. And the classification of these and the toxicity classifications are old, they're outdated, they don't take into account new and current science around things like endocrine disruption and hormonal disruption, or neurotoxicity, and so you're not seeing a lot of what we know today about these health effects in some of the old standards that were formed years ago, and EPA really can't keep up, and as we know, EPA is incredibly crippled at this point. You don't need to read these. It's really to depict, again, that the pesticide use itself has so many ramifications in so many different places. It's on not just on the crops that we're using, but in the contamination of waterways, near local communities where these things are being sprayed. I'll also say we spray manure, and manure also ends up in local communities, on houses. And so people can get sick, and asthma rates can be awfully high near these areas that do get high spray and are near industrial farms. And that, again, also has ramifications, not only for the people who work with it, but the people who live nearby, and even the children of people who are working with these materials. On the right is a profile of Chamacos, which is the health study that's being done here in California and has been for, I think it's almost 40 years now. And it's universities who have been tracking, including here at Berkeley, health effects in farm workers and their children as a result of pesticide exposure, and finding IQ deficits, and still tracking for lots of different health issues, including asthma and other things. And it's these studies that help elucidate some of these health effects that are happening. The government does not necessarily do these, and this is the only way we start to actually learn what's going on over time. So, pesticides were designed to be toxic, and we only learn that more and more over time. Organisms become resistant to pesticides, just like bacteria become resistant to antibiotics. That's just a scientific fact. And so the more you use of it, the more you exacerbate, the more you accelerate that system. And so it's a race to the bottom, ultimately, which is why we find ourselves switching from glyphosate to other more toxic pesticides out there, because these are now becoming not useful. The weeds have surpassed some of these pesticides, whether they're herbicides and weeds become resistant, pesticides and pests become resistant, or antibiotics. Incidentally, we also use some antibiotics in crop production as well. And so it's just another way to understand why organic does offer a lot of solutions in that area and really starts to ground our practices around these things in something that starts to look like a sustainable systemic system. Okay, I'm going to turn now to processed foods, and there's a lot going on in processed foods that's not transparent. Marion's written so many books in this space, and this is just going to be the beginning, but hopefully it will wet your whistle. Companies that are putting new ingredients in the food market are not required to disclose them to FDA. They don't have to tell them about it. They can just put them into the market. If they choose to ask the FDA and FDA has a concern, they are not obligated to do anything about it. And this is all done under the rubric of what's called the GRAS system, which is an acronym for Generally Recognized as Safe. So if you call the FDA and you say, do you regulate new food ingredients? They say, yes, we do. We do it under this system called Generally Recognized as Safe. It sounds great. It sounds like they're doing something, and yet they leave it all up to the industry in order to make those determinations. They do nothing themselves, nor will they ever make a final determination of safety. And so that's very challenging and a very vacuous system that isn't transparent. If you see something like color, flavor, they could have hundreds of ingredients behind them. You don't have to disclose them. You also don't have to disclose processing aids or food contact substances. So these are other words for secondary food additives, things that are used that will come in contact with the food but are not meant to impart an ingredient into the food. We use a lot of those in processed foods, so I'm going to take you through that and what you don't see on the ingredient label itself. Okay, so as I mentioned, the GRAS system really just offshores the responsibility of declaring safety onto industries themselves. They can make that determination, and again, they don't have to disclose anything to the FDA. The GRAS system's been around since 1972, but it has slowly become more anemic over time, and at least before this administration, they were trying to get their hands around that and try to figure out how to improve the GRAS system and make sure that we were actually reviewing safety of ingredients properly. Didn't get very far. And so we're still in a terrible system that is incredibly opaque, that is not really adequately reviewing safety of new ingredients that come out. Why is that important, and especially important now? Because we are developing a lot of new foods out there, a lot of new foods that really exceed the boundaries of typical processing, like fermentation and other things, and are using things that we've never used before and creating things that we've never seen before. And so a system like this has even more of a detrimental effect in the face of that kind of progress that's going on now and that evolution of these new materials in the market. So as I mentioned, food ingredients are disclosed. You know, what's in the food is generally disclosed. Somewhat is colors, flavors, preservatives, nitrates. You don't have to know really whether they're synthetic or natural. And then packaging. So packaging is not required to be labeled, as I sort of mentioned before. We sometimes use carbon monoxide on ground meat to make it stay red. You'll never see treated with carbon monoxide on your meat package. And there's a lot of extraction chemicals that are used in processing and processed ingredients. So when you see something on a package like protein isolate, whether it's soy protein isolate or pea protein isolate, that protein didn't just fall out of those plants. You have to chemically extract those proteins out of those plants. It's incredibly energy intensive, it's incredibly chemical intensive, and so the ingredient sort of belies all of the work that went into making it, and whether or not people who are buying those products necessarily expect that those things are being used. So again, you don't need to dig into these slides, and I've put them here just to represent. This is a solvent extraction system for one ingredient like that, so pea protein or soy protein or xanthan gum or any one, is going to have to go through an entire series of solvent extractions. Hexane is the #1 solvent that is used. Anytime you see refined oil, it's generally been a seed or a fruit that is extracted with hexane. And then you would try to evaporate the hexane off at the end. And hexane is used to sort of pull the ingredients and get everything dissolved at once, and then you evaporate the hexane to eventually get what you want. You probably have a little bit of hexane residue in there. Hexane is a neurotoxin. I'm not suggesting that you're going to have neurotoxicity from processed foods that you eat, but I am wanting to point out that we use a huge amount of this petroleum-derived ingredient. We actually lose a huge amount of it in the air, and we can't account for all of the hexane that's actually used every year in processing and manufacturing. The other ways we can do it are with acids and bases, again, strong sodium hydroxides or hydrochloric acids, and you can, again, dissolve parts and fractions of things that you want to get out of plants. But you must centrifuge things down, you must distill them, you must filter them. And there's also enzymes that can be used to do this, and now we're genetically modifying enzymes in order to make things that they were supposed to make naturally, and now things that they weren't supposed to make naturally. So we have things like GMO yeast making proteins going into some of these alternative, highly processed products. Okay, so here's some examples of issues. And at Consumer Reports, we had a big campaign for, I don't know, it was about a year or two on the natural label and trying to get rid of it, because there are absolutely no standards behind the natural label for what it has to mean. In meat, it means you add nothing to the cut of meat itself. It has nothing to do with how the animal was raised or what it ate. And in processed foods, it has even less meaning. So you can have all sorts of things in there that are not natural per se, that did not just sort of occur in nature, and have them in these products. And we found it to be one of the most misleading labels out there in terms of transparency. And yet more people still confuse natural as being better than organic. So there were a lot of issues we were always trying to get at in terms of disclosing, revealing these things, and then trying to get the changes in behavior that we wanted to see. This is from Friends of the Earth, From Lab to Fork this year. It's a report that they put out talking about the questions around some of the animal meat replacements out there, both in terms of the cell culture meat as well as the plant-based. And this is just a kind of comparison of, if you want a burger, and I hate somewhat that the burgers become the icon for talking about food sustainability, but you can have a grass-fed burger and you can have that meat. What you see on the right are all the ingredients that are used, processed ingredients that all went through those crazy chemical extractions in order to get mixed together in these final products in order to get these various different meat alternatives. Not very natural in the end, and really something we need to question in terms of understanding what are the ramifications of this, what is the life cycle behind this, what is the energy needed to do this. And by the way, you need incredibly sterile conditions to produce all of that. So we're making sterile food ingredients in labs that are highly processed in order to address what is a really important question. I see I have 5 minutes left. It's always bad. So I'm going to zip through these, but these are just, again, if you look, I don't know why bamboo is in the Beyond Meat burger, but it is. No nitrates, never rely on that term. It doesn't mean that. If it says no nitrates, it means a natural nitrating agent could have been used to cure it, but the government requires that they label it as no nitrates. It's a completely idiotic, opaque standard. And I'm just going to, again, zip through this a little bit, which is just some survey work that we've done to try to elucidate what people really think out there. And I guess in terms of transparency, I just wanted to share with you that sometimes, you have to ask, right, in order to figure out what it is. And people make up what people want out there, and that can often change market forces. So these surveys have been a really powerful tool that we used at Consumer Reports, and this is one that we did at Grace when we launched FoodPrint, which is our website, foodprint.org, with a lot of what I've told you today, as well as a lot of solutions around what exists. And this just gives you a sense of people and what they care about when they're shopping for food. And people seem to care about a lot of things. Again, back to that Venn diagram, people aren't buying green just because of their health anymore. That's the way it was 2 decades ago. That's really changing, and people care about who's producing their food. They'll pay more for people who are treated better and have better protections. And that's really heartening at the end of the day to see that shift in what people will do. Now it's about making sure that the choices on the market are really truthful. I'm going to zip through this, but again, it's another way in which we've rated these labels through the criteria of drug use, environment, animal, worker, and assessing these labels on all of those things in order to determine their real broad sustainability value. And if you go to FoodPrint and just take any label, you can start to drill down on these various things, and it will tell you how each label stacks up against each of these criteria. I almost don't want to take you through this. I'm not going to take you through that. But just to say that labels run the gamut in terms of meaning, and we don't have very good regulations out there in terms of what, at a minimum, a claim on a product has to be. You and I could literally slap a label on a product today and go out there and do nothing illegal. And it's a real problem, and so the ability to mislead is really significant on the market, and where there's a lack of transparency, you can see how people may be driven to choices that don't necessarily meet their full expectations, and that's a huge problem. And that's where we start to diminish true demand in the market for the types of products that we really have true sustainability in them. Okay, so quick for tips for getting closer. You're just never going to see a lot of things on the label, and that's why there's a lot of really interesting certifications out there that address a lot of these issues and provide verification and accountability in them. And just back to organic for a minute, we hear probably the most about that label in terms of problems, but that is a function of its transparency. That is because we can actually see what's going on in that program, and that's very different from most of the other labels out there. These claims are also fairly opaque in the market. We talked a lot about antibiotics, but no drugs used for growth promotion is also a claim you might see out there. Free range doesn't mean free range, and so there's a lot of problems in terms of it being undermining. And that's the only thing that natural has to mean in terms of meat. We talked a little bit about that, but if you look at that and you compare it to what the standard is, consumers are being misled across the board. 2/3 of consumers think that the natural label means a whole lot more than it does. So again, highlighting these things it can be revealing for the market and for making better choices. This is what claims need to be reliable, and you can't see that on the package, but you can visit FoodPrint or other, even Consumer Reports, and find out which labels are actually providing this kind of rigor behind them. These are some examples of meaningful labels out there that you can find. There are more, and they are growing. And that right side is really a list of things that don't really go beyond the conventional baseline. The only thing I want you to take from this slide, this is a group I'm working with that we were in Italy together, and one of the amazing things that they're using now is called true cost accounting. And it is an accountability framework that was developed by the UN called TEEB. It's a terrible acronym, but it is basically a way to do accounting across all of these different areas. And while it's hard to ascribe a value to a life or to someone who gets sick, in some ways, I think a lot of you know who are sitting here in a business school, if we can start to make those comparisons between systems and the cost and the benefits, we may be able to really start to empirically show why we need to go in the direction that we need to go. And then finally, You know, I would just say we've got an election cycle coming up. This was in the Detroit Free Press, but it's time to start asking the hard questions of our politicians. We don't know these answers of them in terms of policies and getting policies straight. We need to hold them accountable too, and so just keep it in mind as we start to unfold in the next election cycle. Thank you. Yeah.
Urvashi, I love hearing you talk, but I always lose my appetite.
I know, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Victoria, it's over to you. And I'll move your slides here so that, how about that? The moment you've been waiting for.
I knew I was not super excited to go after you speaking because it was going to be so interesting, but I'm also finding myself a little frightened right now. And kind of scared to eat after this too. Okay, so a lot less exciting for you guys, GSI announcement. So I'm Victoria, the GSI for the class. Wanted to remind you guys of a couple of things. One, weekly reading questions. They are due Sunday at 11:59. Ad drop will be over by then, so no exceptions. If you submit Monday at 12 a.m., you will not get credit. And thank you guys for all of your thoughtful questions. Reading through some of them were really inspiring, and you know, we select a few to present to the class every week, but you guys have been doing an amazing job and have had me and the readers thinking a lot, so please keep that up. It's a lot more exciting to read interesting questions than the non-interesting ones. Formally for the class, we need to have 1 or 2 class representatives. To do that, you need to be in Haas and you need to be an undergrad. It really is mostly stuff around doing the final survey and the mid-semester feedback survey. So if you're interested, please email me as soon as possible. I'll send you kind of what the requirements are, and I'll take the first 1 or 2 people on a first-come, first-served basis. Additional reading materials. So if you look on B courses, you'll see that we do have something there. It's just kind of a list of articles, podcasts, books that didn't make it onto the syllabus because we didn't want you to have crazy amounts of reading, but we thought were really interesting. So please check those out if you want to learn more. Also feel free to send us things that you think should be added to that list. We had someone, I think Sophia, that sent in something to Will this week, and it was really wonderful. So please keep that up if you want to engage. Finally, if you have questions about attendance, grades, logistical issues, please email me. That's my email address there. It's also on the syllabus. It's also on the site, but I should be your main contact if you have any questions. So with that, we are going to try Kahoot again. I don't know, I feel like 50% confident. So you guys can read this over. Hopefully you remember, go to kahoot.it. Great question was last week. If you only need to do this if you are registered for the class and need attendance. So I'm gonna try pressing buttons while you guys are going to kahoot.it, and something should happen soon. Yay! Okay, so you guys should be able to type in your PIN. Please remember, use your entire first name, first 3 letters of your last name, so that I'm not looking at the attendance trying to figure out what's happening. You should see yourself come up here. Give it a minute until there's like, I don't know, probably like 100 people should be logging in. Shout out to Air Bears for actually working. And as a side note, if you do this and you are concerned that somehow you didn't get on there or you're having a technical mishap, feel free to email me right after class with your name and sadness. All right, I'll give it like 10 more seconds. 120 seems about right. Uh-oh. All right, so the way that this works, the question's gonna appear, hit whatever excites you most about this class. We'll get to see what you guys say. Can you see it okay? Yeah. was more exciting when the music worked. All right, that seems about right. All right, well, it looks like most of you guys are excited to hear cool speakers, which I think our speaker today definitely lived up to. But awesome, great. Well, thanks for doing this. I'm glad it worked. I will pass it back to you while I download this and don't lose this important information.
Thank you, Victoria. You know, last week we did a little exercise in class. We had people estimate the number of meals they might eat in a day or times they eat in a day, and then think about how many years that they might live, and then how many meals that was for each person, and then collectively the number of people in the room. It was over 15 million meals.
Wow.
And some of our colleagues at Stanford have done some research showing that people who are going into college, that this is sort of the most sort of catalytic time for them to establish, for people to establish the kinds of habits, and because they're going away from home, they're on their own, they have to eat in a new environment. So this is a, if you think about a system, and a point to
absolutely,
participate in a system or intervene in a system, as Danella Meadows says. This moment in a college person's life is really fantastic.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of the beginning of your purchasing power in this world, and in some ways, that's a really powerful thing. And even if we can't get policies in place, right, or regulations don't work, you can vote basically with your dollar and buy the things that you want. And if we can actually shift demand in that meaningful way, 15 million meals, companies listen and things change. And it's really powerful.
I always appreciate that you bring, kind of the scientist's dispassionate voice to this. Marian Nessel, who's here with us, she's giving 3 lectures on campus in the journalism school over the next several weeks. And she's done enormous amount of research about the influence of corporations and other sources of power. You didn't really mention any of that. You mentioned the FDA's not doing this necessarily, the EPA's not doing that. But if you want to understand more about why that might be,
yes,
you should definitely go to Marian's lectures, right?
Absolutely.
One happens actually right during the State of the Union address next Tuesday. So I'd really encourage you to go to that. It's going to be a really good way to spend your time.
It's the anti-State of the Union. Sorry, Mary.
Well, we had some great questions from the class this week, and one of them, is Emma here? Is Emma Weston? Emma, come down to this microphone. Do you remember your question? Memorized? Tell us, who you are, what you're studying, what year you are, be transparent.
So I'm a sophomore.
If you look up there, they'll even see you on the camera. How about that?
Okay. I'm a sophomore. I study environmental economics. What else?
That's enough.
Okay. My question was, as a student who has a limited amount of money to spend each month, what would you suggest is the best and cheapest way to reduce our footprint?
Yeah.
Footprint.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And I think, so there are a lot of really good tips on FoodPrint actually for, how to maximize your dollars. And Consumer Reports has a lot of good information too. I would say probably getting foods in season, and you're lucky to be in California because you have such an amazing richness out here, and getting it locally can be sort of a real cost savings. If you love certain things, freezing things is a good idea if you don't find them during all times of the years. I know for us, berries go up and down $10 for a box of strawberries right now, so that's not something I'm buying either. There are ways to sort of get those deals. There's also some really interesting, and I know as students you may not be thinking about it, but as you sort of group up and you're living with lots of people, there are some really interesting community-sponsored agriculture programs where you pay in initially and then you pick up your whatever it is, your lot of produce, or there's fish CSAs, there's flower CSAs, but again, all around agriculture, so you can kind of get that best value and getting it close to the source.
I would imagine it's hard, like if you don't have a freezer or a kitchen, or talk more about that. Like, what are the challenges you face? Where are you eating? How are you eating?
Well, I actually have a freezer, and because I have a kitchen and everything. Okay. So it's more like I find when I go to the store and like try to buy organic foods and stuff like that, and it's always like a lot more expensive than to buy non-organic.
Yeah, and you want to, if you're in the store, I think it's always good to kind of prioritize. Things that are fresh have the most value. So I always say, organic corn has more value than corn flakes. Once you sort of process things to that degree, you really diminish the value add. But meats and milks and things that are so fresh, it does make a big difference in terms of the quality of those products and the makeup of those products in terms of what you can get. And so maybe if it's about meat too, you eat a little less and maybe eat a little better when you do eat it, kind of thing. And it's a bit of a trade-off.
One of the parts of Donella Meadows' systems dance is about expanding the time horizon. And I think about this argument about organic food being more expensive. It's more expensive now, but it's a lot less expensive later. So if you were to think about that horizon of your life and you thought about maybe the medical costs or the environmental consequences, the costs of each of these extreme weather events, I worry about just they're going to get way ahead. Again, you talked about the government not keeping pace with the rate of change.
Yeah.
The cost of these extraordinary weather events connected to climate change is going to add up so quickly that it's going to be really difficult for the economy to flourish.
Yeah, that's right. And thanks for saying it that way. I mean, there are these externalities that we just don't account for right now, and climate is one of them, pollution is one of them, antibiotic resistant bacteria is another one, and so that is not in the cost of the package of chicken that you buy. And so the true cost accounting I was mentioning at the end in that UN framework is trying to get at that, and how do you take those externalities and actually bank those costs into the system so that in the end you can understand what is truly valuable in the end compared to not.
I'm just going to build on Emma's question, but does FoodPrint is there any guidance for how much money or what portion of a person's ability to spend should be spent on food? I always grew up sort of knowing like, well, your rent should never be more than 25% of what your take-home pay is. Is there guidance around food?
I don't know it offhand. Marion, do you have any thoughts on that? I don't. You pay nothing because you're farming it. Yeah, that's right. We pay nothing.
You can give Marion the microphone. She doesn't want the microphone. Emma, thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was really great. Yeah. Megan, is Megan here? Megan Visco? Great.
Hi.
Okay, so I have a question. It sort of relates, but so one of the major problems with the American diet is the amount of processed food that people eat, which is typically made from some form of soy, wheat, or corn. All these foods are being subsidized by the federal government, which means that government money is being used to fund a diet that causes health-related diseases and obesity. But considering how many congressmen come from states that benefit from these subsidies and how many food production companies rely on these items being cheap, it seems very difficult to create change. So how can people who have very little influence on what's provided to them in grocery stores change such a deeply rooted systemic problem?
It's an easy question.
Thank you.
Yeah, let's just back into processed foods for a minute. I mean, there's a new interesting study out in France, a retrospective talking about, lifespan now and processed food consumption. And I think the more we understand, the more we know that processed food isn't the way forward in terms of our health. It doesn't seem like it's the way forward in terms of other health aspects of the food system. And we're up against a behemoth out there, you're right. We're subsidizing all of these crazy commodities and then really amplifying their use in the system. I mean, with corn, I think it's exactly the reason why our animals eat so much corn. In Europe, they don't eat so much corn because it's not subsidized that way. Soy is another thing that animals don't eat. That's not their natural diet. And not to be the broken record, but I think the hope out there is that you have farmers and you have systems that truly are trying to address every one of those things that you brought up in terms of the problems with those commodities, in terms of relying on things excessively that then turn the system into the lopsided way that it is. And the more we can understand what those options are and the right ones, and the more demand we create for those, the more they move. So organic is the largest growing agricultural segment out there, and it has been for the last 20 years. Grass-fed products are now hitting a rate of 20% growth a year. Still, organic is only 1% to 2% of the agricultural land out there, so it's very small. But we have to start somewhere, and I think while it's sort of hard to see the finish line, knowing that there's economic viability in these systems is out there. There are ways to do it. We are starting to now link up all of these connections. So when the climate funders started to become interested in food, I was thrilled because they hadn't been talking about food at all. And so capitalizing on these maybe unfortunate but really fortuitous intersections, I think is also going to help tip over and get us to that tipping point where it just doesn't make sense to keep doing it the way we've been doing it this whole time. But it won't be until we look at it through that sort of complex prism that I think we'll be able to compel enough people from enough different walks to actually see it.
Thank you for that question.
Yeah.
I appreciate that each of these issues, people bring a set of perspectives, maybe vested interests. The label that you showed of the plant-based meat is just really interesting because there's such movement now towards the plant-based diet. The Lancet Eat Commission basically says the plant-based planetary health diet, right? So it's really interesting thinking about fruits and vegetables, but then you show us a label that it's, it's plant-based, but it's really processed.
Yeah.
And it's got all this other stuff in it.
That's
so,
right.
That leads us to the work that Michael Pollan did a number of years ago where he said, eat food, mostly plants, not too much, right? So I just find, just building on that, I also thought it's really interesting that a lot of the plant-based burger companies as a way to market makes a lot of sense. They're going through food service, so they team up with chefs.
Yeah.
And in food service, which you think you can get the anointment or the endorsement of a really high-quality chef, that's going to have the halo effect that it must taste good, and but in the food service channel, you don't get to see anything. I mean, there's not even a label that would give you an unpronounceable ingredient. So, what do you think about that?
Well,
how do you reconcile sort of packaged goods and food service, our experience and the transparency or lack thereof?
Well, I think, yeah, there's absolutely, food service is a tricky area because it is sort of an iron curtain. I don't know if anyone knows, Bon Appetit just adopted some new animal health guidelines now on how they're going to procure their meat. And they're very transparent about it. And that's the type of transparency we want to see in procurement as well. And there's really a lot of opportunity for that, both at institutional levels, and I think for people to put pressure back up, including you all at the cafeterias here that you eat at. I think, though, that you're right. Part of the problem in getting a lot of this sustainable food on the market is through that it's a very narrow path and getting into those distribution chains. And so we need to be working on that and how we get the distribution of these things more accessible to more people. I will just say a little bit on the meat. You know, I come from an Indian family, and my grandmother was vegetarian, and my parents ate mostly vegetarian, not all the time, but there was plenty of food. We were not short on food, and I guess the question is, you know, in creating these solutions, what's the problem it's addressing? And at this point, you can get as much protein as you need from a fresh vegetable and produce-based diet if you're vegan, if you're vegetarian. And so to me, it's puzzling why we have cultivated this path of new processed foods in order to address something that we can actually already address right now.
Is Alexa Karp here? Could you come down, please?
Hi.
Tell us about yourself.
I'm a society and environment major, second year. My question was basically about this whole alternative meat debate. But I'll kind of go from more of like the sustainability standpoint. What do you think, like also as a toxicologist, like is it better to eat the burger or go for the plant-based meat that has 50% less emissions and things like that? Like, what is your take on that?
So, yeah, right, emissions and toxicology are kind of not one and the same, and yet we want to think about both of those things when we're thinking about the right solution or what makes sense. Personally, I would probably go for the real burger and eat it less frequently. And I guess maybe I'll just, as a toxicologist, I am concerned about those ingredients. And I didn't mention, but in the Impossible Burger, for example, the genetically modified yeast that they use to make the soy leg hemoglobin that makes the burger bleed, that's a protein that's made from the yeast. But the yeast made 47 other proteins as well. And they didn't know what to do with that, so they just throw the whole yeast sludge into the burger. So now we're eating 48 new proteins that have never been in the human food supply before. FDA did get wind of it, actually, and did make comments to them saying, we're kind of concerned about those 47 other proteins. And they don't really have to do anything about it. I guess as a country that is constantly putting things on the market before we understand safety and then only taking action when we understand harm, I always say, my kid, I'll be dead, my kids will be dead, your kids will be dead, and we won't get a handle on this. And so, the precautionary principle is something that Berkeley uses, San Francisco uses in policymaking, which is that if you are not sure of safety or you're unsure of it, then you don't move forward with something until you really know. And you take caution with things until you know that they're okay to use. And that's just, unfortunately, flipped the opposite for that entire industry. Is everything going to be toxic and be a problem? No. Can you eat plant-based foods right now without eating those products? You can. So it's really, up to everybody to decide what they want to do, but at least to understand what it is you're eating when you're eating it.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're really in a new era too of, food innovation and disruption, because traditional venture capital has discovered food really in the last 5, 7, 10 years. And so these new companies with kind of game-changing ideas with giant markets have attracted enormous amounts of capital. So the businesses look much larger than they are, and in the press they always say, oh, it's a $250 million company, meaning it raised $250 million, not that it's generating that kind of revenue. So there's a lot of opacity too, and there's a lot of hype around the adoption, and there are some organizations now that are effectively funded by people that really care a lot about animal rights, but they're promoting that kind of product as an alternative, but it doesn't necessarily address the whole issue.
No, and I think to your point, the opaqueness of the investment also, we don't know what the costs really are. And one example that has sort of come up through the news ranks are in lab cultured meat, so where you take animal cells and you try to raise them, is that you still need animal product to raise that product. So you need growth medium. These days we grow cells with something called a fetal serum. So you need fetal animals and you need to extract the serum from them in order to grow these cells. And this is what the medical community has been doing forever when we do in vitro tests. Now they're trying to make this as an animal alternative, and yet it's still relying on these animal inputs. So some of the solutions that are coming out are how do they make possibly a engineered solution that is plant-based. And right now, 1 liter of that is costing $4,000 in order to make that. So it's not viable. But we don't know that right now. And so the cost of doing these things is really, really high. And I'll just say the last thing, is this technology. There's a lot of technology investment and technology driving these things. And as a scientist, I love technology. I find it very interesting. I also try not to aggrandize what is possible with it and try to leave it in the context of what we know. The way you make an animal cell line immortal is to inject a cancer cell gene into that line, which will make it grow forever, essentially. So we're going to grow cancer tissue, and we're not even talking about that now. I think as it comes out more and more, we will all start to understand more and more. But as a toxicologist who's looking at those things, I don't understand where the return on investment is at the moment, and I think that remains to be seen.
And it's fair to say, just listening to you tonight, that there's not some protective force looking out for our good.
No. USDA and FDA had a cabal in terms of, it was like, do you want to regulate it? Do you want to regulate it? I guess we'll regulate it. So it's not even clear through what crack it will actually be regulated under.
We have this class at Berkeley Haas that we offer at the graduate level called Food Innovation Studio, and where people are coming up with ideas and then figuring out how to start a new enterprise. We spend a fair amount of time thinking about the precautionary principle, unintended consequences, and we like to kind of substitute the notion of it's not necessarily about disruption. It's really about stewardship in food. If you're going to take a systems approach, you really have to think as an entrepreneur that I'm actually a steward of a lot of resources as opposed to the disruptor of an existing market.
That's right.
So if we can, sort of integrate that kind of thinking, I think we'll get more responsible, longer-term system solutions.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think just in terms of accountability, I think there's a huge place for technology, and I'll just mention, it's a little bit tangential, but one of the projects I'm working on right now, which is really meaningful, is work going on in North Carolina, where these communities who live in Kenmore Alley, as they call it, but where they live with contaminated rivers, from many things, including industrial ag, where their homes are very near these farms and hose down in manure, that technology is actually helping citizen science and citizens be able to start to measure things like air quality. They're measuring fecal matter on people's houses and being able to tie bacteria to the farms nearby. And that, in fact, led to a win this year on Title VI, which is a nuisance suit. It's in the environmental statutes, but it was really interesting because we were able to break through something here in terms of accountability and transparency through technology.
That's fantastic. Any other questions in the audience? Yeah, come on up. Introduce yourself. And if you have another question, you can come down and sort of get in line at this microphone or that microphone.
Hi, my name is Isabel Myers. I'm a junior and I'm studying environmental economics and policy. So my question is, how does our food system, in terms of transparency, compare to other countries, and can we use other countries' regulations as a model for our own?
Thank you.
Yeah, for the most part, we sure have a lot of what's called confidential business information, CBI, where companies can basically protect a lot of their information and not disclose it. And that does not exist to the same degree in Europe or in Japan. Japan has some really interesting progressive regulations around food. Every time I stumble on something, it's always Japan that's doing it. And so there are other countries to look for. EU regulations are, and their chemical approval system is supposed to be based around precaution. It's called REACH. And so I think there is a lot to learn from those countries. And respectively, when we work at a global level, we're also able to help other countries prevent other underminings that go on. And just one example I'll give you is that chicken companies were trying to get chicken washes approved in Europe for carcass washing, but Europe actually has standards for hygiene at the farm level, which we don't. And so they don't want washes at the end of the line. I think it's more than 20 countries in Europe have less than 1% salmonella rates because of this type of systemic approach that they take. And we run about 10% to 15% salmonella rates on our poultry. So it matters. And there are other countries who are doing a better job in many places in their food systems compared to us. Canada follows us in general. We have a lot of, if you think about it, beef, sometimes the borders are fairly open at this point in terms of beef production, and they go through, and Canada tends to default to the FDA regulatory systems.
Urvashi, just as we've got, come on up, we'll have you next, but for like the next 10 minutes, let's try also to focus on where we can take action. So
Great.
The theme of this class this year is really to get down to an understanding of, what can we do as individuals, what can we do in our communities, what can we do at the state, national, global level, how do we, get involved? And I know you're at the heart of that, so you're next.
Just want to say thank you first for talking about such an important topic around transparency in food. I work for a local nonprofit that is trying to solve that problem in food service. I'm working across food service, whether it's restaurants or cafeterias. And one of the problems that we're trying to address is in procurement. And we have a really hard time figuring out how to verify farms that don't have certifications, large and small, but particularly the small farms. Do you have any solutions for small farms, both for animals and for other agriculture that either can't afford the certifications or just have complications?
Who I'd like to direct you to is Grow NYC, which is a group in New York City, I think similar to your group, and they're in charge of all the farmers markets. And they have 250 farmers markets in New York City, and that exact challenge is in front of them. And so you have certified producers, and that's great. That takes care of that. And then what do you do with all of these smaller producers who are transitioning in some way or doing something? And The business of verification is a really tough one. And then you become accountable in some ways. And so how can you defer that? There's a couple different ways. People can collectively be certified. This Farmers Market Grow NYC has actually hired somebody who's going to be doing that now. They already had an inspector, but now they have someone who's going to try and manage some kind of merged approval scheme. So it's tricky. You don't want to do it one by one. And you probably want to limit what you're going to verify for, so that you can make sure that you're doing it in a reliable and accountable way as well. I'll also mention that I'm working on another project where we're trying to impart a new line of meaning on grass-fed production. USDA allows grass-fed claims where you can use antibiotics, you can confine the animals, they didn't have to be on pasture the whole time. So we're forming an organization that's actually trying to hold a line and work with procurement groups to say, here are the certifications that get you there. And for institutional buying, you can't do one by one by one. You need these broader certification programs to penetrate the market and to get in on that mass scale. Both are important, but trying to work both of those channels is equally important too.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.
You have a question? Come on up.
Hi, thank you. That was great. I learned a lot.
Thanks.
I have a question.
Introduce yourself,
I'm
please.
Sophia. I'm a graduate student and I work in water remediation.
Great.
So my question is about food labeling, and you showed this on a couple slides, but on a lot of packages you'll see something like natural or artificial flavor. And I don't think most consumers are aware of the difference between those two things and the similarities. So maybe to frame that in the lens of change, where do you see kind of food labeling going in order to educate and bring more transparency to consumers?
Well, I think the marketing standards in our country are so poor that it's really difficult to get rid of these claims. And as someone that's been working on it for 20 years, I'm disappointed with where we are at this point in terms of just trying to rid the market of these baseless claims that really don't mean anything. And I guess what I would say is that when you're out there and looking at claims and they sound vague or they seem too simple, probably therein lies an issue that you want to probe. And so things like no artificial flavors, 7-Up got sued for using the natural claim because they were using artificial preservatives or something. And they fought it in court, and at the end of it, they decided, the court continued to let them use natural, but they had to qualify it and just say no artificial flavors. And yet, the artificial preservatives were still in there. They didn't change the formulation of anything. And you will see these kind of incremental jockeying moves that come out of these cases. I will say that up until very recently, bringing suits against misleading claims had to be a class action. It means you had to find a group of consumers who felt that they were somehow cheated. And it's hard to prove harm to a class of consumers based on labeling. But now, and this was after a Palm Coca-Cola case, the ability for, say, a trade association like this Grass-Fed Alliance we're trying to form will now have the power to sue another company for unfair business practices and take it out of the class action avenue. That's very powerful for maybe trying to bring some of these misleading claims to suit and to have a better legal victory so we can start to get rid of some of them.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for being here today.
Thanks.
My name is Adrian Rodriguez. I'm a recent graduate off the MBA program here.
Congrats.
As someone who feels slightly empowered in this system where there's so many systemic things going on, I often think about what's the best way that we can kind of put pressure back on the system, one, to be a watchdog for a future. So, living in Berkeley, I think one of the special things is we've done that with the soda tax. We've done that with plastic bags, and now we're also implementing measures to put taxes on packaging from takeouts to eliminate that waste. What are other ways that we can at least put roadblocks in the way, so we can actually be preventative. And whether that's the environmental example you gave, what are ways that we can put pressure on the USDA, FDA to take action, as well as on the federal and local policy level.
So I find in my experience, and thanks, that was a great question, that the government needs data, and they need, the more quantifiable things are, the easier policy is to be made, the easier politicians are to be influenced. And so you can take something like sustainable food, which has so much ethical and value and philosophical meaning, and in a way, the better we get at quantifying that, the better able we're going to be to make those changes that we're going to need to make. There are tons of data sets out there, like the NHANES database. I don't know if anyone's heard of that. That's the CDC. It's the National Health and Examination Survey. And they take your diet, they ask diet questions, they measure blood and urine. There's tons of these sets that have dumped tons of data out there, and it hasn't been synthesized. And to the degree we can start synthesizing that and showing causality and associations between consumptions of certain things and health outcomes, between exposure to certain things and other health outcomes, I think that's where we're going to start to see the power of the evidence. In this case in North Carolina, we're trying to take things from a nuisance suit to a public health suit. It should be a health violation that people get their houses sprayed with contaminated manure. That should actually be a health violation. So we have yet to get to that, but I think the horizon's pretty wide open for those associations to be made, and the stronger we make them, I think the more powerful we'll be.
Thank you. Can I just share my little pet peeve?
Please.
This word consumer.
Yeah, you told me not to say it.
Well, did I?
You did. You were like, we try not to
It didn't
use
work
that word.
then. Well, no, but I didn't mean for you
know.
not to say it. But my pet peeve is really that, as long as we maintain a mindset that we are consumers, we're never going to get to a point where we're either treated respectfully, we're just treated as, something that's
At the trough.
consuming.
Yeah.
So I keep grasping for what's that word? Last year we were playing with the word eater, citizen, but that's sort of the challenge. How do we change the lexicon? How do we change our mindsets to change the system as well? And you're such a spokesperson for this whole thing. I'm hoping you can
Figure that out.
Yeah, you're talking in all these groups. You can inoculate them
After
with a new
working
word.
for a group that had that word
Right.
in it for 17 years, it's hard to get it out of me.
Yeah.
But yeah, and it isn't just about consumption. I agree, and that sounds kind of the wrong word, but I think steward, we're all stewards of this. And I would just say as a toxicologist, it's one of the things we have the greatest exposures to on a daily basis. And when we think about long-term health effects, it's all predicated on that. And so, it isn't just about consumers, is it? It's about being a steward of this system and really creating resilience across the board in us, in how we make things and how we produce things, and in the food that we're making too.
Let's have a big hand for Urvashi.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Will. Thanks.
And next week, we have the inimitable Daphne Miller, Dr. Daphne Miller, who is an expert in how our health is affected from the soil up.
That'll be great.
So see you next week at Edible Education.